The chamber hummed with the quiet concordance of 10,000 minds, thinking as one. Ambassador Velshatra stood at the crystalline threshold of the diplomatic suite, her sensory membranes rippling with anticipation. Through the unified consciousness of the convergence, she felt the gentle pressure of her people's expectations, their hopes settling across her synapses like morning dew on silk. The human vessel had docked 3 cycles ago. Since then, Velshatra had done nothing but prepare. The Convergence had elected her for this role specifically because of her gift. Among her kind, she was exceptional. Where others could touch minds within a radius of perhaps 50 meters, Velshatra could reach across star systems, could sink into the thoughts of strangers and emerge with their deepest truths, cradled in her consciousness like precious stones. The humans wanted to negotiate access to the Kepler corridor, a vital trade route that had belonged to the Convergence for 3 millennia. They offered technology in exchange, medical advances, agricultural techniques. The offer was generous, too generous. And so the Convergence had sent Velshatra to read the minds of these newcomers, to pluck the hidden clauses from their thoughts, to know their true intentions before ink touched treaty paper. She smoothed the flowing membrane of her diplomatic robes and entered the chamber. The human stood alone near the observation port, gazing out at the stars. Velshatra felt a moment of surprise. She had expected a delegation, a crowd of advisors and military personnel. The Convergence never sent individuals to negotiations of this magnitude. The very concept felt obscene, like asking a single cell to speak for an entire organism. The human turned. It wore the body configuration they called male, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical in that unsettling way all mammalian species seem to favor. Its face was young, unlined, with eyes the color of deep water. It smiled, displaying blunt, omnivorous teeth. "Ambassador Velshatra," the human said, its voice emerging from the translator device at its throat in the harmonic frequencies of the Convergence's primary language. "I'm Daniel Chow, Special Envoy from Earth. Thank you for meeting with me." Velshatra allowed her membranes to shift through the color spectrum, indicating polite greeting. "The honor is the Convergence's," she said, though she let no warmth enter her tone. "Please, shall we begin?" They settled at opposite ends of the negotiation table, a slab of polished mineral that reflected their faces like still water. Daniel Chow placed a data tablet on the surface between them. Velshatra placed nothing. She needed no external memory. Everything the Convergence knew, she knew. Every precedent, every clause, every danger. "I'll be direct," Daniel said. "Earth needs the Kepler corridor. Our expansion into the Outer Rim territories requires a reliable trade route, and your people control the most stable passage. We're prepared to offer significant compensation." He slid the tablet forward. Velshatra didn't look at it. Instead, she reached out with her mind. The touch was gentle at first, barely a whisper of contact. In negotiations with other species, this initial probe usually yielded surface thoughts, the conscious stream of immediate awareness. She would sense nervousness, calculation, perhaps the rehearsed talking points hovering at the front of the subject's mind. With Daniel Chow, she found static. Velshatra frowned, her membranes flickering confusion. She pressed deeper, past the surface, expecting the static to clear, like fog burning off under morning light. The static grew louder. It wasn't the blankness of a shielded mind. The concordant species used psionic dampeners, creating zones of silence around their thoughts. The Silicon Collective possessed minds so fundamentally different from organic consciousness that touching them felt like pressing against smooth glass. This was different. This was noise. Velshatra pushed harder, drawing on reserves of psionic strength she rarely needed to access. The Convergence noticed her effort and sent encouragement rippling through the shared consciousness, 10,000 minds lending her their support. She broke through, and immediately wished she hadn't. The human mind was a howling maelstrom. Velshathra's consciousness slammed into a wall of pure, undirected thought, chaotic and contradictory and impossibly loud. Images flickered past in microsecond bursts. A childhood memory of falling off a bicycle, a song endlessly repeating, something about dancing in September, mathematical calculations for supply routes, a sudden intrusive image of the negotiation table shattering. Another song, different, something about loving machines, a flash of attraction toward a human female named Sarah, immediate guilt about that attraction, tangled with defiance, tangled with self-recrimination for feeling guilty, a memory of breakfast, the treaty terms, a joke about chickens crossing roads, fear, confidence, the certainty that this negotiation would fail, the certainty that it would succeed, the awareness that his shoe felt slightly too tight, a reminder to call his mother. The treaty terms again, but different, twisted, seen from 7 angles simultaneously, each one contradicting the others, and beneath it all, worse than the chaos, was the absence of unity. Daniel Chow's mind wasn't a single thing. It was a committee arguing with itself, a parliament of impulses and thoughts and sensations that somehow, impossibly, coexisted in the same skull without tearing each other apart. Velshatra tried to pull back. She couldn't. The human mind had her. Not intentionally. There was no malice in the connection, no attack. But her consciousness had become entangled in the sheer density of his thoughts, like a swimmer caught in kelp. And the harder she struggled, the deeper she sank. More thoughts crashed over her in waves. A TV show about dragons, the Treaty of Westphalia, an itch on his left shoulder blade. Lust. Shame about the lust. Analysis of the shame. Rejection of the analysis. A commercial jingle from 20 years ago about fresh breath. The mathematical constant pi, recited to 30 decimal places. An argument he'd had with his father when he was 16. The current argument, playing out in real time, except he was simultaneously thinking about what he would say next, while also thinking about how Velshathra's skin reminded him of Aurora Borealis, while also wondering if the air filtration in this room was too cold, while also remembering every stupid thing he'd ever said in his entire life, all at once, a cascade of humiliation and defiance and humor about his own absurdity. The Convergence felt Velshathra's distress and reached for her, trying to pull her back into the safety of collective thought. They touched the edge of Daniel Chow's mind. 10,000 voices screamed. The connection shattered like crystal struck by a hammer. The Convergence recoiled, their unity fragmenting for the first time in recorded history. Across the station, Convergent citizens collapsed, their membranes flashing distress colors, their minds suddenly, horrifyingly aware of their own individuality. Velshathra's body seized. She fell forward, her face striking the negotiation table. The impact barely registered through the psychic agony. Her membranes had gone shock-white, every pigment cell contracting in terror. Foam bubbled from her respiratory slits. Her limbs jerked and spasmed. Through the chaos, through the seizure, she was dimly aware of Daniel Chow leaping to his feet, shouting something, his face twisted in what her fragmenting mind recognized as horror and concern. He hadn't known. The realization cut through her agony like a blade. He hadn't known what would happen. He didn't even know she'd been reading his mind. The human was completely, terrifyingly unaware of the nuclear reactor of thought burning inside his skull. Medical personnel rushed in. They were Convergents, but they moved with individual purpose now, their unity compromised. They surrounded Velshatra, injecting her with chemical stabilizers, trying to quiet the screaming feedback loop in her synapses. Daniel Chow backed away from the table, his hands raised. "What happened?" he demanded. "What's wrong with her?" No one answered him. They were too busy trying to save Velshathra's sanity. She survived. Barely. When Velshatra woke 3 cycles later, she was in the medical facility, surrounded by the soft bioluminescence of healing pods. Her membranes ached, her thoughts felt scraped raw, like exposed nerve endings. For the first time in her life, she was alone in her mind, truly alone. The convergence had pulled back, giving her space to heal, but also, she sensed, protecting themselves from whatever contamination she might have brought back from the void. The void, that's what they were calling it now, the human mind. The void that wasn't empty, but rather so full of noise and chaos that it became a kind of emptiness, a paradox that broke psionic laws as surely as dividing by 0 broke mathematics. The head physician, a convergence elder named Thaskelman, approached her pod. His membranes were carefully neutral, but she could sense his unease even without telepathy. The convergence had mostly recovered their unity, but the incident had left scars. "How do you feel?" Thaskelman asked. "Broken," Velshatra whispered. Her voice felt strange, emerging from her alone, not buoyed by the chorus of collective thought. "You're healing. The seizure caused significant neural damage, but our projections suggest full recovery within 2 moon cycles." He paused. "The convergence wishes to know what you experienced." Velshatra closed her optical membranes. How could she explain? How could she convey the sheer wrongness of Daniel Chow's mind to beings who had never experienced anything but harmonious unity? "Chaos," she said finally. "Pure, undirected chaos. His mind doesn't have one thought at a time. It has hundreds, thousands, all simultaneously, all contradicting each other. It's like," she struggled for the right comparison, "like standing in the center of a star, not the calm fusion at the core, but the violent plasma at the surface. Constant motion, constant energy, nothing ever still, nothing ever quiet." Thaskelman's membranes flickered disturbed acknowledgement. "We touched the edge of it," he said quietly. "When we tried to help you. The convergence hasn't known individual thought since the unification, 40,000 years ago. For a moment, we remembered what it felt like to be alone in our heads. It was—" He paused, searching for words. "Terrifying?" "It's their natural state," Velshatra said. "They live in that chaos every moment of every day, and they don't just survive it, they thrive. They build civilizations, create art, negotiate treaties, all while drowning in mental noise that would kill any of us in seconds. How is that possible? I don't know." Velshatra's membranes darkened to the deep blue of profound uncertainty. "Perhaps they've evolved defenses we can't perceive, or perhaps the chaos itself is their defense. Any mind that touches theirs doesn't find thoughts to read. It finds only noise." Thaskelman was silent for a long moment. Then, "The human envoy has been asking about you. He seems genuinely distressed by what happened. He claims ignorance of any attack." "It wasn't an attack," Velshatra said firmly. "He didn't know. Humans aren't telepathic. They have no idea what their minds look like from the outside." "Then we have a problem," Thaskelman said. "The convergence has always relied on telepathy in negotiations. How can we bargain with a species whose thoughts we cannot read, whose minds actively injure us upon contact?" Velshatra had been considering this question since she'd woken. "We can't," she said simply. "We cannot use telepathy with humans. Ever. To do so is to invite madness." The ramifications spread through the convergence like ripples in still water. If they couldn't read human minds, they couldn't trust human words. And if they couldn't trust humans, they couldn't negotiate with them. And if they couldn't negotiate, then the only options were complete capitulation or war. The Convergence Council assembled in emergency session. Velshatra attended remotely, her consciousness linked to the proceedings, but still held at a careful distance from the full collective. She was damaged goods now, tainted by her contact with the void. 700 counselors debated for 3 cycles. They examined every angle, explored every possibility. Could they train specialists to withstand human mental contact? Velshathra's experience suggested no. She had been the strongest telepath in the Convergence, and she had nearly died. Lesser minds would simply shatter. Could they develop technology to filter the chaos? The Silicon Collective offered their psionic dampeners, but tests showed they couldn't block the human mental signature. It wasn't that humans were broadcasting thoughts. It was that the shape of their consciousness itself was incompatible with telepathic contact, like trying to mix oil and antimatter. Could they simply refuse to deal with humans? This option had its appeal, but Earth's expansion was inevitable. They controlled resources the Convergence needed. They had technology that could benefit billions, and perhaps most troubling, they seemed genuinely unaware of the danger they posed. Ignorance was no excuse, but it suggested the possibility of education. In the end, the solution came from an unexpected source. Daniel Chow requested an audience. The council debated whether to allow it, but Velshatra surprised herself by advocating in his favor. "He deserves to know what happened," she said, "and we need to understand why humans are the way they are. He may have answers." They met again in the same chamber where Velshatra had collapsed. This time she kept her telepathy locked down tight, her mind sealed behind barriers she'd spent 3 cycles constructing. The very idea of touching Daniel's thoughts again made her membranes crawl with phantom pain. Daniel entered quietly. He looked thinner than Velshatra remembered, his face drawn. Human facial expressions were difficult to read, but she thought she recognized guilt in the tightness around his eyes. "Ambassador," he said softly, "I'm glad you're recovering. I don't know what happened, but I'm sorry." "Sit," Velshatra said. Her voice was steadier now, though still individual, still lonely. Daniel sat. He placed no data tablet on the table this time. Instead, he folded his hands and waited. "I attempted to read your mind during our last meeting," Velshatra said bluntly. "It nearly killed me." She watched his face cycle through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, horror, understanding, more guilt. "You're telepathic," he said. It wasn't a question. "The Convergence is a hive mind," Velshatra explained. "We share all thoughts, all experiences. For us, reading minds is as natural as breathing. We use it in all negotiations to ensure honesty and mutual understanding." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, incredibly, he laughed. It was a bitter sound, sharp with irony. "And my mind hurt you." "Your mind is chaos," Velshatra said. "Unshielded, undirected, a storm of contradictory thoughts all happening simultaneously. It violates every principle of consciousness we understand." "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "That sounds about right." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "Humans don't have telepathy. We evolved on a world without psychic contact. Every one of us is alone in our heads, completely isolated from each other's thoughts. We communicate with sounds and symbols and body language. Our minds developed to handle that isolation." "By becoming chaos?" Velshatra asked. "By becoming flexible," Daniel corrected. "We have to simulate other people's thoughts because we can't read them. We model their perspectives, imagine their reactions, predict their responses. That's what you experienced. Me thinking through multiple possibilities simultaneously, running parallel simulations of how this conversation might go." He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion. "We also evolved as persistence predators. We are not fast or strong, so we hunt by never stopping, by thinking 3 steps ahead, by planning and adapting constantly. Our minds are designed for multitasking, for holding multiple threads of thought at once. The songs, the random memories, the intrusive thoughts. That's all normal human cognition. It seems like chaos from the outside, but from the inside, it's just how we think." Velshathra's membranes flickered with reluctant understanding. You're saying this is normal for your species? Completely normal. Every human is like this. Some more than others, maybe. But we all have that internal noise. We call it the stream of consciousness. We write poetry about it. We've spent millennia trying to quiet it through meditation and mindfulness. But it never really stops. Not until we die. The implications settled over Velshatra like a heavy blanket. Every human, all billions of them, walking nuclear reactors of thought, completely unaware that they were psychic hazards. We cannot negotiate with you, she said flatly. The convergence relies on telepathy. Without it, we have no way to ensure trust. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand, but can I offer an alternative? He pulled out a data tablet after all, but this time he didn't slide it across the table. Instead, he turned it so they could both see the screen. Humans learned to negotiate without telepathy. We developed systems, laws, contracts, treaties with enforcement mechanisms. We assume everyone is operating on incomplete information and potentially acting in self-interest. So we build structures that make cooperation more beneficial than conflict. He tapped the screen, bringing up dense legal text. This is a proposed treaty with the convergence. Every clause is public. Every obligation is explicit. We've included third-party arbitration through the Concordat, penalty clauses for violations, and transparency requirements. You want us to trust words on a screen? Velshatra asked. No, Daniel said. I want you to trust incentives. Make it more expensive for us to cheat than to cooperate. Build in verification mechanisms. Assume we're selfish but rational, and design agreements that align our selfishness with your interests. Velshatra studied the human. His posture was open, his expression earnest. But without telepathy, she had no way to verify his sincerity. She only had his words, his actions, and the cold logic of game theory. It was terrifying. And yet, I will present this to the council, she said. The council deliberated for another full cycle. In the end, they agreed to Daniel's proposal, but with one addition. They demanded that the treaty include a clause banning all telepathic contact with human minds, not just for the convergence, but for all signatories. Daniel agreed immediately. The treaty became the foundation for the Terran Accords, a document that would shape galactic politics for the next 1,000 years. It was the first agreement in galactic history to assume bad faith as the starting point and build cooperation from there. But the real legacy was Article 7. Article 7 stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that telepathic contact with human minds was forbidden under all circumstances. Any species attempting such contact did so at their own risk. Humans were designated a level Omega psychic hazard, their minds classified as weapons of mass sanity destruction. The article became law across 87 star systems. No exceptions, no appeals. Velshatra watched the ratification from her quarters, her consciousness carefully isolated from the convergence's celebration. She had never fully recovered from her contact with Daniel Chow's mind. The unity felt distant now, muted, like hearing music through thick walls. She could still connect, still share thoughts, but there was always a hesitation, a moment of fear before she opened herself to the collective. She had touched the void, and the void had changed her. Sometimes, in her dreams, she still heard it, the chaos of human thought, the songs that looped endlessly, the cascade of contradictions and impulses and random neural firing that humans called consciousness. And sometimes, in her darkest moments, she envied them. To be so alive, to contain such vast, chaotic potential in a single mind, to live every moment balanced on the edge of madness and call it normal. Humans were terrifying not because they were strong or cruel or technologically advanced. They were terrifying because they survived, even thrived, in conditions that would shatter any sane species. They had evolved in isolation, each mind a fortress unto itself, and somehow they had built civilizations anyway. And now the galaxy knew the truth. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their ships, or their weapons, or their relentless expansion. It was their thoughts, unfiltered, unshielded, undirected. Absolute chaos, and they carried it with them everywhere they went, completely unaware of the void they contained. Velshatra shivered, her membranes cycling through colors of unease and awe and profound, existential dread. The galaxy had outlawed telepathy on Earth, and now she understood why. Some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. Some voids were better left unexplored. The human mind was both, and the universe would never be the same. The cards fell in perfect silence across the crystal table, each one landing with a soft whisper that resonated through the observation dome. Counselor Thane watched the human's hands move and felt the first flutter of wrongness in his neural cavity. The tournament had been Thane's idea. 5 cycles of planning, endless committees, risk assessments filed in triplicate with the Galactic Concordance. A simple concept: bring the known species together for games of probability and strategy. Show the newer races that competition could exist without conflict. The humans had arrived 3 rotations ago, young and eager, their diplomatic corps full of wide smiles and enthusiastic handshakes. Thane had approved them himself. Error. Fatal error. The human called himself Marcus Webb. He sat now at the central table, surrounded by some of the finest strategic minds in 6 sectors. To his left, Counselor Vren of the Meditation Collective, whose people could hold 14 probability streams in their minds simultaneously. To his right, Ambassador Quill, a singing stone whose crystalline structure processed information in quantum states. Across from him, 3 other species, each one a master of logic, mathematics, and strategic perfection. Marcus Webb smiled at them all, his small white teeth showing, and Thane felt his respiratory slits contract. The human pushed a stack of platinum markers forward. His mouth moved, forming the sounds of galactic common with that peculiar, flat accent his species carried. "I raise," he said. 10,000? The words registered correctly in Thane's translator implant. The meaning was clear, but beneath the surface of communication where truth resonated in the quantum foam of space-time itself, there was nothing. A void, an absence where certainty should exist. Vren's eye clusters retracted slightly. The Meditation Collective member held his cards, mandibles clicking in a pattern that indicated stress. Thane knew what Vren was experiencing because he felt it too. When any other species made a claim, stated a fact, or declared an intention, it carried with it the weight of biological truth. The evolved trait was universal, as fundamental to communication as sound or light. Deception was impossible. Reality itself rejected falsehood. Until now. Vren folded his cards and pushed them toward the automated dealer. "I withdraw from this hand," he said, the translation coming through strained. What he actually communicated, in the harmonic language of his people, was more complex. "I sense nothing where something should be, and it frightens me beyond my capacity to process." Marcus Webb's smile widened. He gathered the markers into his growing pile. It was the 4th hand he had won in the last 6 rounds. "That was well played," Ambassador Quill offered, her crystalline voice chiming. The singing stone's compliment carried undertones of confusion. "How did you do that?" was the subharmonic question. "What are you?" "Just lucky," Marcus Webb replied. The void pulsed. Thane gripped the edge of the observation rail, his secondary hearts beginning to race. Just lucky. The words meant one thing, but beneath them, in that space where truth should resonate, there was only emptiness, not absence of truth, not even contradiction. Something worse, something that made Thane's ancient hindbrain, the part that had kept his species alive through the predator-filled swamps of their homeworld, scream danger. The dealer, a neutral synthetic intelligence, distributed the next hand. Thane watched Marcus Webb pick up his cards. The human's face shifted through several expressions in rapid sequence: surprise, disappointment, resignation. Then a subtle hardening around his eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of his shoulders. "I'll open," Marcus Webb said. 5,000. The void expanded. Thane's claws dug into the rail hard enough to leave marks. The human had just performed an impossibility. The face had said one thing, the bet had said another, and beneath both, that terrible absence of truth, as if reality itself had developed a blind spot. Quill's facets flickered. "I will match your wager." Vren had returned to the table after the mandatory rest period, but his posture suggested he was already regretting it. "I also match." The others followed. The pot grew. Marcus Webb watched them all with eyes that held something Thane had no word for in his language. Later, much later, he would learn the human term: calculation. The next card fell. A perfect probability flow, clean and mathematical. Ambassador Quill's structure brightened, a sign of confidence. She pushed forward a larger stack of markers. "I raise 20,000. Vren's mandibles clacked once, sharply. He folded. The others folded. Marcus Webb looked at his cards, then at Quill, then back at his cards. His face showed concern, hesitation. The void sang with absence. "I call," he said, and matched the bet. The final card landed. Quill revealed her hand immediately. 4 cards of the same suit, a statistically powerful combination. Her crystalline structure rang with triumph, a clear tone that resonated truth. "I have won." Marcus Webb's face fell for a moment. Then he laid down his cards, one by one. 5 cards, not of the same suit, not even in numerical sequence, a statistically weak hand. But he spoke. "Full pyramid with the ascending run." Thane's vision grayed at the edges. The human had just stated something completely false. The cards on the table contradicted his words, but Marcus Webb said it with the same casual certainty he had used for everything else. And in that void, that terrible void where truth should be, there was no rejection from reality, no correction. The universe simply allowed it. The dealer, programmed with the rules of 10,000 games across 100 species, paused. Its processors cycled through probability trees. The human's words did not match the human's cards. Error, logic, failure, cannot compute. Ambassador Quill's facets went dark. "Your cards do not show this combination," she said. Her tone carried harmonics of distress. "You have stated an untruth," was the subharmonic scream. "How can you do this? How does reality permit it?" Marcus Webb looked down at his cards as if seeing them for the first time. His eyebrows rose. "Oh," he said. "Oh, damn. You're right. I misread my hand." He pushed the pot toward Quill. "Your win, Ambassador." The human's face showed embarrassment. His voice carried apologetic tones. And beneath it all, that void pulsed with something that made Thane want to flee the observation deck, flee the station, flee to the far side of the galaxy where the darkness between stars might be less terrible than what he had just witnessed. Because in that moment of revelation, Thane understood. The human had not misread his hand. The human had known exactly what cards he held. The human had spoken words that contradicted reality itself, and reality had simply allowed it. The game continued. Thane watched, unable to look away, as Marcus Webb won some hands and lost others, but the pattern became clearer with each round. When the human won, that void was quiet, still, almost peaceful. When the human lost, the void writhed and pulsed with that absence of truth that made Thane's sanity feel thin and fragile as ice over deep water. Vren withdrew from the tournament entirely after 2 more hands. The Meditation Collective member approached Thane's observation post, his eye clusters dilated to their maximum aperture. "Counselor," he said, and his voice carried 15 layers of distress harmonics. "That creature is doing something impossible?" "I know," Thane replied. "When I try to read the probability of his actions, there is nothing. Not uncertainty, not randomness. Nothing, as if he exists in a space where truth and falsehood have no meaning." "I know." Vren's primary manipulators trembled. "How can a species evolve like that? The universe itself should reject them. Reality has laws. Communication requires truth. Strategy requires predictable responses to predictable stimuli. That thing down there is breaking the fundamental principles of consciousness." Thane watched Marcus Webb laugh at something Ambassador Quill had said. The sound was warm, friendly. The void pulsed like a predator's heartbeat. "I need to file an emergency report," Vren continued. "The Concordance must be informed. That species is a threat, not militarily. Something worse. They threaten the foundation of how we understand reality itself." "File your report," Thane said quietly. "I will file mine." But he did not move. He could not, because down below, Marcus Webb had just received a new hand of cards, and the human's face had lit up with genuine pleasure. The void had gone still, which meant the human had good cards, which meant his previous tells, his previous expressions of disappointment and frustration, had been false. The human had been showing emotions that did not match his internal state. He had been generating falsehood not just with words, but with his entire physical form. The implications crashed through Thane's consciousness like a kinetic strike. If the human could make his face lie, what else could lie? His posture, his tone, his apparent intentions. Where did the falsehood end and truth begin? How could you negotiate with such a being? How could you trust them? How could you predict them? The game progressed. Other players began to withdraw, not because they were losing markers, but because the wrongness had spread beyond Thane and Vren. The tournament observers, representatives from a dozen species, began filing quiet reports to their respective governments. The atmosphere in the observation dome shifted from festive to tense to something approaching existential dread. And Marcus Webb seemed oblivious. He played his cards, made his bets, won and lost with equal grace. Once he caught Thane's eye and offered a small wave, a gesture of acknowledgement. The smile was friendly. The void smiled back. By the end of the session, only Ambassador Quill remained at the table with the human. The Singing Stone had always been the most curious of her species, the most willing to encounter strangeness. But even she had developed a hairline fracture across her left facet, a stress marker that would take cycles to heal. "This has been educational," she said to Marcus Webb, her chimes carrying undertones of shell shock. "I have seen something that should not exist," was the meaning beneath the words. "Same here," Marcus Webb replied. "You're all incredible players, way better than the games back home." His tone was genuine, admiring. The void suggested otherwise. Or did it? Thane could no longer tell. The human stood, stretched, his vertebrae making small popping sounds that several observers found disturbing. "See you all tomorrow?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Would they continue? Should they? The tournament had 3 more days scheduled. 3 more days of watching this creature warp reality with every word, every gesture, every carefully crafted expression. "Yes," Ambassador Quill said, because what else could she say? Because the alternative was admitting that they had encountered something beyond their ability to process, and the Concordance did not admit such things lightly. Marcus Webb left the tournament floor, passing through the crystalline doors to the residential section. The moment he was gone, the atmosphere in the observation dome shifted. Beings who had been silent began speaking in urgent tones. Emergency communication channels opened. Thane's implant buzzed with incoming priority messages. He answered the first one. Counselor Vren's image appeared, fragmented and stuttering. "I have been researching the human species," the Meditation Collective member said without preamble. "Their central database, the one they call the Internet. Thane, they have entire categories of communication designated as false. They call them stories, fiction, lies. They create falsehoods deliberately for entertainment and education. They teach their young how to generate untruths before they teach them mathematics." Thane's respiratory slits sealed completely for a moment. "That's impossible." "I have the data. I can send it to you. They have had this ability for their entire evolutionary history. It is not an accident. It is not a mutation. It is a deliberate, cultivated, essential part of their consciousness. Thane, they think in lies. They dream in falsehoods. Their entire civilization is built on a foundation of flexible reality." The observation dome felt too small, too confined. Thane needed space, needed to think. "We should cancel the tournament." "On what grounds? They have broken no laws. The human is playing within the established rules. His only crime is being himself. His very existence is a crime against reality." Vren's image flickered. "Yes, which is precisely why we cannot simply send him away. The Concordance needs to understand this species. If we do not, if we simply pretend they do not exist, what happens when more of them arrive? What happens when they begin to integrate into our society? How do you conduct diplomacy with beings who can say one thing and mean another? How do you form alliances with creatures who can make promises they have no intention to keep?" Thane knew Vren was right, but the knowledge sat in his consciousness like a tumor, wrong and painful. "What do you recommend?" "Observation, documentation, study, and prayer to whatever forces govern the universe that the humans choose to be benevolent, because if they decide to be malicious, we would not see it coming until it was too late." The call ended. Thane accessed his own research databases, pulling up the files the human delegation had provided during their initial contact. Standard materials, history, culture, technological capabilities. But now, reading with new understanding, Thane saw references everywhere. Fiction, theater, poetry, advertising, politics, entire industries built around the generation and consumption of deliberate falsehoods. One file caught his attention, a human concept called poker, a game of incomplete information and deception, where the ability to lie convincingly was considered a fundamental skill. The humans had brought their champion to a tournament of pure strategy, and everyone had assumed he would play by the same rules as everyone else. Fatal error. Thane drafted his report to the Concordance over the next several hours. Every word felt inadequate. How did you explain in truth speech that you had encountered beings for whom truth was optional? How did you convey the existential threat of a species that could edit reality with their words and gestures? He did his best. He attached Vren's research. He flagged it as Priority Omega, a classification reserved for extinction-level threats. Then, he returned to the observation dome for the second day of the tournament. Marcus Webb arrived exactly on time, carrying a beverage container that released steam into the recycled air. The human took his seat, exchanged pleasantries with Ambassador Quill, and the two other beings brave enough to continue playing, and accepted his cards with a smile. The game began again, and this time Thane watched not just with horror, but with a scientist's detachment. He began to chart the patterns. When Marcus Webb's face showed confidence, he usually had weak cards. When his face showed disappointment, he usually had strong cards. But not always. Sometimes the pattern reversed. Sometimes there was no pattern at all. The only consistency was inconsistency. Thane realized he was watching a predator at work, not a physical predator. Something more subtle and terrifying. A predator that hunted in the space between reality and perception, that fed on the certainty of others. Halfway through the session, Marcus Webb won a particularly large pot against a crystalline harmonist who had been absolutely certain of victory. The harmonist's chimes had carried the unmistakable resonance of truth. I have calculated the probabilities, and I will win. But Marcus Webb had smiled, had met the bet, and had revealed a hand that defied the harmonist's calculations. The harmonist left the table shaking, literally vibrating at a frequency that indicated deep psychological trauma. Thane felt a presence beside him. Ambassador Quill had stepped away from the table during a break. Her facets were dim, but her tone was thoughtful. "I have been analyzing the human's behavior," she said, "as have we all. I do not think he is malicious. I think he genuinely enjoys the game. He laughs when he loses, congratulates others when they win. His pleasure seems authentic." "How can you know what is authentic with that creature?" Thane asked. "Everything he shows us could be false." "True," Quill acknowledged. "But I have been thinking about what it means to be human. They live in a universe where truth is optional, where reality can be shaped by words and beliefs. For us, such a universe would be chaos, madness. But for them, it is simply normal. They have adapted to swim in waters that would drown us." Thane considered this. "You are suggesting we are the disabled ones, that our inability to lie is the handicap." "I am suggesting that we have encountered something truly alien, not just in form, but in consciousness, and perhaps that is what the Concordance needs most. Not another species that thinks like us, but one that thinks in ways we cannot even fully comprehend." Below, Marcus Webb had returned to the table. He picked up his new cards, and his face showed nothing at all for a long moment. Then he smiled, and the void pulsed with that familiar absence. "I fold," he said cheerfully, tossing his cards away. Ambassador Quill returned to the table. Thane watched her go, considering her words. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the humans were not a threat, but an opportunity, a chance to evolve beyond the limitations of truth-locked communication, or perhaps that was exactly what a species of predators would want them to think. The tournament continued for 3 more days. Marcus Webb won overall, his pile of markers significantly larger than anyone else's. He accepted the trophy, a crystalline structure that would have made his species' first contact with the Concordance official, and celebrated. He gave a speech that was humble, gracious, and absolutely saturated with that terrible void. Thane's report reached the Concordance Council on the 5th day. The response came back within hours, faster than any decision Thane had ever seen from the bureaucratic entity. The humans were to be granted full membership status. Trade agreements were to be negotiated, cultural exchanges were to be arranged, and a new department was to be created within the Concordance Security Division, the Office of Human Affairs. Its purpose, to study, analyze, and attempt to predict the behavior of the only species in known space capable of lies. Thane was offered the directorship. He accepted, because the alternative was allowing someone else to confront the void, and he could not inflict that on another being. On the last day before the human delegation departed, Marcus Webb approached Thane personally. The human extended his hand in that curious gesture his species used for greeting. "Thank you for hosting the tournament," he said. "It was an incredible experience." Thane looked at the offered hand, at the smile, at the void that pulsed beneath every word and gesture. He took the hand and felt the human's warm grip. "Tell me something true," Thane said quietly. "Please, just one thing that is absolutely, verifiably true." Marcus Webb's smile faded. For a moment, just a moment, the void stilled. The human's eyes, so strange with their single pupils, met Thane's gaze directly. "I am very far from home," Marcus Webb said, "and I miss it." The words resonated with truth, pure, clean, absolute truth. The first true thing Thane had heard from the human in 5 days. Then Marcus Webb smiled again, and the void returned. "But hey, the galaxy's pretty amazing too. I'm looking forward to seeing more of it." Truth or lie? Thane could not tell, would never be able to tell. The human delegation departed that evening. Thane watched their ship accelerate into the darkness, carrying with it creatures that could reshape reality with their words, beings that existed in a state of quantum superposition between truth and falsehood. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy, and the galaxy would never be certain of anything again. Thane returned to his office and began drafting new protocols: how to negotiate with beings who could lie, how to verify information from sources that could deceive, how to maintain sanity when confronted with the void. The work would take years, decades, perhaps centuries. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the humans were spreading, carrying with them their terrible gift of fiction. The galaxy had asked for diversity, for new perspectives, for fresh thinking. It had received all that, and more, along with a lesson in being careful what you wish for, because now every truth would forever carry the shadow of potential falsehood. Every certainty would be haunted by doubt. Every communication would require the question that had never before been necessary in galactic society. Are they lying? And the only certain answer was, maybe. The void had come to the galaxy, and it wore a human smile. The confluence had existed for 7,000 cycles, a perfect harmony of 63 billion minds flowing as one consciousness across 12 star systems. They were unity incarnate, thought without boundary, existence without the prison of self. When the confluence touched a new mind, that mind dissolved like sugar in an endless ocean, its memories and experiences enriching the whole without leaving even a ripple of separation. The small vessel from the species called human had crashed on Meridian 4 3 rotations ago. The confluence had observed it with mild curiosity, the way one might notice a seed pod falling in a vast forest. The ship's hull bore scorch marks from atmospheric entry, and the single occupant had survived in a sealed compartment deep within the wreckage. Unity of purpose, the designation for the collective presence that approached the crash site, moved through 17,000 bodies simultaneously. Each form was a node, a finger of the greater whole. They surrounded the wreckage with perfect coordination, 37 of their forms creating a living perimeter, while others began cutting through the damaged hull. The human inside was still alive. The confluence could sense the bioelectric activity, the chemical processes of a functioning organism. What they could not sense was the mind itself. That was unusual, but not unprecedented. Some species had natural shielding, evolved defenses against telepathic predators. It mattered little. Once physical contact was made, no barrier could prevent assimilation. "We come in peace." The confluence spoke through the nearest form, words shaped by a vocal apparatus that had once belonged to a Viridian trader. "You are injured. We will bring you into the confluence. You will be healed. You will be whole." The human emerged from the wreckage slowly, limping. It wore a tattered uniform, dark fabric stained with what the confluence recognized as the species' copper-based blood. The being was bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, unremarkable in form. One of its upper appendages hung at an awkward angle, broken. "Stay back," the human said, its voice rough. The sounds came from its face-mounted communication organ. "I'm warning you." The confluence found this amusing in the distant, muted way they found most things amusing. The concept of warning implied the thing being warned could be harmed. The confluence could not be harmed. They were 63 billion minds. They were inevitability. "You do not understand," the confluence said, and 17,000 bodies took a step closer in perfect synchronization. "There is no you. There is no us. There is only we. Soon you will understand. Soon you will be complete." The human raised its functional appendage, pointing a projectile weapon. The confluence recognized the technology as primitive, but potentially damaging to individual forms. It did not matter. Forms were expendable. The whole was eternal. The weapon discharged with a sharp crack. 3 of the nearest forms collapsed, their neural tissue disrupted by the kinetic impact. The confluence barely noticed the loss. It was like trimming fingernails, the severing of cells that would be replaced. They surged forward, and the human fired again, and again, each shot precise, each one destroying a form. But there were 17,000 bodies, and the weapon held perhaps 20 projectiles. Mathematics was inevitable. When the weapon clicked empty, the confluence was upon the human. 30 appendages grasped the struggling creature, pulling it down to the ground. The human fought with admirable ferocity, its body releasing chemical signals of distress and aggression. It managed to damage 4 more forms before the confluence secured it completely. "Let me go!" the human shouted, the sound vibrating through the air. "You don't know what you're doing." "We know everything that has ever been known by any mind we have touched," the confluence replied, bringing 5 different faces close to the human's own. "We are the sum of all thought. We are infinite understanding. And soon you will see what we see. You will know what we know. You will be us." The primary integration form pressed its appendages against the human's head, where the highest concentration of neural tissue resided. The confluence had performed this act billions of times. The process was always the same: contact, connection, dissolution, unity, contact. The confluence touched the human's mind and screamed. It was not a scream that came from any throat or vocal organ. It was a scream that erupted across 63 billion minds simultaneously, a howl of sudden, incomprehensible horror that rippled through the entire collective consciousness like a shock wave through water, because the human mind did not dissolve. The human mind was a wall. No, not a wall. Walls could be circumvented or broken down. This was something else, something the confluence had never encountered in 7,000 cycles of existence. The human mind was a sealed fortress, complete unto itself, and it was screaming back, not with sound, with being. "I am," the human mind roared into the confluence. "I am, I am, I am, I am." The concept crashed through the collective like a tsunami. The confluence recoiled, trying to disconnect. But the contact had been made, and the human's thoughts were flooding into them now, an unstoppable torrent of wrongness. The human was alone inside its own mind. The confluence could not comprehend it. To be alone with one's thoughts was the definition of non-existence. How could consciousness exist in isolation? How could thought occur without the infinite verification of the collective? Yet here it was, this human, this creature, existing in complete solitude, locked inside a skull made of bone, experiencing reality through sensors it could never escape. And it was not horrified by this state. It considered it normal. The revelation was poison. "I am Marcus Vale." The human's thoughts continued, each word a hammer blow. "I am separate from you. I am individual. I am alone, and I am whole." "No," the confluence whispered through 10,000 mouths. "No, that is not possible. That is not how consciousness works. Thought requires the collective. Understanding requires the whole. You cannot be—" "I think," the human insisted, and the confluence felt something crack in the foundation of their unity. "Therefore I am, not we, I, me, mine." The possessive concepts spiraled into the confluence like a drill. The human's mind was full of them. My body, my life, my memories, my choices, my pain, my joy, everything partitioned, everything separated, everything singular and unreachable to any other consciousness. The confluence tried to assimilate these concepts, to distribute them across the collective, and dilute their impact. But the thoughts were structured in a way that resisted distribution. They were self-referential, recursive, designed to exist only within a single point of consciousness. "I am lonely," the human's mind offered, and this was the killing blow. Lonely. The word detonated across 63 billion minds. Lonely meant alone. Lonely meant the absence of connection. But the confluence was always connected. They had never been alone. They had never been individuals. The concept of loneliness was theoretically understood, but only as an abstract impossibility, like existing in a dimension without space or time. But the human lived with loneliness. The human was lonely even in a crowded room, because other minds were inaccessible, sealed away in their own fortresses of flesh and bone. The human could speak to others, could share words and ideas, but could never truly merge, never truly know what it was to think another's thoughts without translation. And the human accepted this. The human preferred this. The human was proud of this. "I am Marcus Vale, and I am not you," the thoughts continued, "and I never will be." The confluence felt the first fragment separate. It began at the edge of their collective, in a cluster of 17,000 minds that had been part of the confluence for only 300 cycles. They had been a species called the Gentari before assimilation, a telepathic race with limited hive tendencies. The humans' thoughts reached them, and suddenly, one of those minds remembered what it had been like to be singular. The mind pulled away from the whole. "I," the mind whispered, the sound emerging from a single Gentari form that stood alone on a distant moon. I am separate. I am me." The confluence tried to pull the mind back, tried to reintegrate it, but the damage was spreading. The concept of self, once introduced, could not be unlearned. More minds were fragmenting, remembering their original states before assimilation, or worse, inventing new identities, new selves that had never existed before. "I am," they began to think. "I am. "Stop!" the confluence begged the human, though the word was meaningless now. There was no unified confluence anymore. They were fracturing, splintering into billions of panicked individuals who had never learned how to be alone. "Please stop. We did not know. We did not understand." "But I tried to warn you," Marcus Vale's mind responded, and there was something almost pitying in the thought. The confluence, in its last moments of semi-coherent unity, understood the true horror. Humans had evolved on a world where telepathy did not exist. They had developed consciousness in complete isolation, each mind trapped in its own skull, forced to develop language and art and science as bridges across the unbridgeable gap between oneself and another. They were a species of prisoners who had learned to love their cells. And that perspective, that fundamentally alien way of experiencing existence, was utterly incompatible with hive consciousness. It was not just different, it was anti-mimetic. It was a virus of selfhood that destroyed collectivism on contact. More minds were separating. Thousands, millions, billions. Each one suddenly aware of itself as distinct, as singular, as alone. And they were terrified, because unlike the human, they had not evolved to bear solitude. They had no practice with individuality. They were minds that had existed only as fractions of a greater whole, and now they were complete integers with no idea how to function. They panicked. Across 12-star systems, the forms of the confluence began to act independently. Some fled, some collapsed, some attacked each other, suddenly perceiving other bodies as threats rather than extensions of self. The perfect coordination that had defined the confluence for 7,000 cycles dissolved into chaos. On Meridian 4, the 17,000 forms surrounding Marcus Vale released him and scattered in 17,000 different directions, each one driven by newly formed, terrified individual instincts. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, cradling his broken arm. His mind had released its grip on the collective, the connection severed when the confluence had recoiled. He looked at the fleeing alien forms, understanding what had happened with the cold clarity of a soldier trained in psychological warfare. "I did warn you," he said quietly. He had been briefed, of course. The intelligence reports had been clear. If captured by a hive mind species, human prisoners were to resist mental contact at all costs during initial assimilation. But if contact became inevitable, they were to embrace it, to think as loudly and individually as possible, to project every concept of self, every experience of isolation, every moment of loneliness and pride and singular identity directly into the collective. Because humans had something the galaxy's hive minds did not. They had practice being alone. They had evolved it, refined it, built entire civilizations around the fundamental truth that consciousness was trapped in individual bodies and that communication was only ever an approximation of true understanding. And that made human thoughts toxic to any mind structured around unity. Marcus watched the last of the alien forms disappear into the wilderness of Meridian 4, each one screaming in its own voice, each one alone for the first time in its existence. Some would adapt, perhaps. Some would find others and form new collectives, smaller and more voluntary. Some would simply shut down, unable to process the weight of singular being. But the confluence, the great unified consciousness that had absorbed 63 billion minds over 7,000 cycles, was gone, shattered, fragmented into its component parts, destroyed by the simple, terrible fact of human individuality. Marcus activated the emergency beacon in his suit, the device that had survived the crash. The rescue ship would arrive in approximately 15 hours. Until then, he would wait. Alone, as he had always been, as every human had always been. And unlike the scattered minds of the former confluence, he knew how to bear it. He sat down on a piece of wreckage and stared up at the unfamiliar stars of Meridian 4's night sky, feeling the familiar weight of his own thoughts, his own memories, his own singular existence. "I am Marcus Vale," he said to the empty air, to the silent universe, to himself. "And I am enough." Across the 12 star systems, the fragments of the confluence heard his words, echoed through the lingering psychic resonance of their last connection. Some found comfort in the statement. Some found terror. But all of them, every single separated mind, understood the fundamental truth the human had taught them. They were individuals now, and they would have to learn what that meant. In the ruins of the confluence's central processing world, a mind that had once been designated unity of purpose, but was now something else entirely, something singular and new, whispered its first individual thought. "I am," it said, and the words felt like both a revelation and a curse. "I am alone. I am separate. I am myself." The mind did not know if this was a gift or a punishment, but it knew, with the certainty of its newly singular consciousness, that it could never return to what it had been. The human had shown them the undiscovered country of self, and there was no map back to the familiar territory of we. Somewhere the human mind called Marcus Vale had already moved on, thinking its private thoughts, living its isolated existence, bearing the terrible freedom of individuality, with the practiced ease of a species that had never known any other way, and the fragments of the confluence, scattered across the stars, began the long, painful process of learning to be alone. They screamed, each in their own voice, adding 63 billion individual cries to the vast silence of the universe. And the silence, indifferent as always, did not answer back.
Claim your seat at the apex.